Sindbad the Sailor, Part 1. Once there lived a poor porter Sindbad who came across a lovely mansion and envied its master. Sindbad the sailor, who was the master of the mansion, inquired about his envy and offered him wine and food to eat. Then Sindbad the sailor narrated his story, 7 voyages, of how he became rich, to the porter and others at his mansion. After his father's death, Sindbad spends all his wealth and was left with nothing. But then he decided to work hard and earn all the wealth back. He decided to become a merchant. Sindbad joined some merchant traders at Basra on a ship to reach out to different countries. The crew halted on a small island for rest. As they were hungry, some of the crew started to cook, and Sindbad decided to take a look around the island. Suddenly everything around him started shaking. All the crew members ran and got to the ship, but they didn't notice that they left Sindbad behind. Then they realized that it was not an island but the back of a sleeping whale. The whale started going under the water. Sindbad was left floating in the ocean with the help of a wooden log. He floated for several days and finally reached a shore of an island. There he saved the king's horse from a supernatural sea monster. The king gratefully accepted him and gave him a job on his port. One day the ship that abandoned him came to the port. He went to the king and told him that he is leaving for his homeland. As the king was very happy with his work, he gave him lots of rewards, which Sindbad traded and became rich.
Once upon a time there was an old pig with 3 little pigs, and one day she said to them, "My children, it is time for you to go out in the world and seek your fortunes." So, bidding their mother goodbye, the 3 little pigs set out to earn their living. The first little pig, whose name was Whitey, met a man with a bundle of straw and said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me that straw to build a house with?" The man gave Whitey the straw, and he built himself a house with it. Presently a wolf came along and knocked at the door of Whitey's house. Little pig, he said. "Let me come in." But of course Whitey didn't want the wolf to come in, so he said, "No, no, by the hair on my chinny chin. This made the wolf angry, and he said, "Then I'll puff and I'll huff, and I'll blow your house in." So he puffed and he huffed and he blew the house in. And he carried poor little Whitey away to his home in the forest. The second little pig, whose name was Blackie, met a man carrying some wood, and he said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me that wood to build a house with?" The man gave Blackie the wood and he built himself a house with it. But along came the wolf and knocked at the door of Blackie's house. Little pig, he said. "Let me come in." "No, no," replied Blackie in great fright. "Not by the hair on my chinny chin. Then I'll puff and I'll huff and I'll blow your house in." So the wolf puffed and he huffed and at last he blew the house in. And away he went with Blackie to his home in the forest. Now the third little pig, whose name was Brownie, met a man with a load of bricks and he said to him, "Please, mister, will you give me those bricks to build a house with?" The man gave him the bricks, and Brownie built himself a very snug little house with them. He had just finished his house when the wolf came along. Little pig, he said. "Let me come in." "No, no, by the hair on my chinny chin. Then I'll puff and I'll huff and I'll blow your house in." But though the wolf puffed and he huffed, and he huffed and he puffed, he could not blow down Brownie's house made of bricks. So he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice field of turnips." "Where?" asked Brownie. "Over in Mr. Smith's field. If you will be ready tomorrow morning, I will call for you and we will go together and get some for dinner." "Very well," answered Brownie. "I will be ready. What time do you want to go?" "Around 6 o'clock," answered the wolf. Got up at 5 o'clock and went out and got the turnips and was back home before the wolf came at 6 o'clock. When the wolf found that Brownie had been to Mr. Smith's field before him, he was very angry, and wondered how he could catch him. So he said, "Little pig, I know where there is a nice apple orchard." "Where?" asked Brownie. "Down at Merry Garden," replied the wolf. "I will go with you tomorrow morning at 5 o'clock and we will get some apples." But Brownie hustled and bustled around, and went the next morning at 4 o'clock to the apple orchard. This time he had farther to go and had to climb the tree, so that just as he was getting down with the apples in a basket, he saw the wolf coming. Of course he was frightened. When the wolf came up to the tree, he said to Brownie, "Ah, I see you are here before me. Are they very nice apples?" "Yes, indeed," replied Brownie. "Here, I will throw one down to you." And he threw the apple so far that while the wolf was running to pick it up, the little pig jumped down from the tree and ran home. Now the wolf was very, very angry, and he thought and finally thought of a plan to catch the little pig. Coming to his house the next morning, he said, "Little pig, there is a fair in town this afternoon. Will you go?" "Oh, yes," replied Brownie. "I will be very glad to go. What time will you want me to be ready?" "At 3 o'clock," said the wolf. But Brownie went off to the fair at 1 o'clock and bought a great big copper kettle. Alas! On the way home with the kettle, he saw the wolf coming up the hill. Poor little Brownie! He didn't know what to do. And then suddenly he jumped into the copper kettle and gave himself a push. And the kettle went rolling over and over, with the little pig in it. When the wolf saw the kettle coming rolling toward him, he was so frightened that he turned and ran back home without going to the fair. The next day he stopped at the little pig's house and told him how frightened he had been by a great, shining thing that had rolled down the hill toward him. Then Brownie laughed, and said to the wolf, "Ha! I frightened you, Mr. Wolf. I had been to the fair and bought a copper kettle, and when I saw you coming I got into it and rolled down the hill." This made the wolf so very angry that he jumped up onto the roof of the little pig's house and started to climb down the chimney. When Brownie saw this he made a blazing fire in the fireplace and hung the copper kettle over it full of scalding water. And just as the wolf came down the chimney, the little pig pulled off the cover of the kettle and plop! Into the scalding water fell the wolf. So Brownie boiled the wolf, and then went out and rescued his two brothers, Whitey and Blackie, from the forest where the wolf had been keeping them. And they all lived happily together in the little brick house forever afterwards.
Subscribe the channel.
Once upon a time, there lived an ant and a grasshopper in a grassy meadow by the river. It was during the hot summer season when the ant was toiling hard by collecting wheat grains from the farmer's field. The ant would work hard all day long from dawn to dusk collecting the heavy grain well balanced on her back. She would then put the wheat grain in her larder carefully and rush back to the field to collect another grain. She would scurry back and forth between the field and her larder, often doing this task the whole day. On the other hand, there was a grasshopper in the grassy meadow who would spend all his time in singing and dancing. He would often scorn at the ant for toiling so hard the entire day in collecting the grains. He would frequently call the ant to join him in singing, dancing and making merry of the present time. However, the ant would ignore him and continue with her work. This would make the grasshopper laugh even louder, and he would often ridicule the ant, stating that they have enough food to sustain themselves in summer. Hearing this, the ant said that she was saving some food for the cold season and recommended the grasshopper to follow the same. The grasshopper didn't pay heed to her words and continued singing and dancing merrily. Soon summer faded to autumn and autumn to winter. It became freezing cold outside due to snowfall, and the sun was barely visible and the nights were long and dark. Out of cold, the grasshopper lost his interest in singing and making merry. He was cold and hungry and had no place to take shelter from the snow outside. He wondered how to save himself from this tough situation. Suddenly he remembered about the ant and visited her for some food and shelter. Off he went to her place and knocked at her door for help. When she opened the door, the grasshopper offered to sing for her in return for some food and shelter. To this, the ant replied that she had toiled hard in summer to save enough food for winter, and the grasshopper had mocked her then. She gently asked him to sing somewhere else and earn his food and shelter. It is then the grasshopper realized that he should have saved up enough for the winter instead of wasting his time being lazy during summer and singing and dancing around. Moral of the story: make hay while the sun shines.
The hare amp, the tortoise. A hare was making fun of the tortoise one day for being so slow. "Do you ever get anywhere?" he asked with a mocking laugh. "Yes," replied the tortoise, "and I get there sooner than you think. I'll run you a race and prove it." The hare was much amused at the idea of running a race with the tortoise, but for the fun of the thing he agreed. So the fox, who had consented to act as judge, marked the distance and started the runners off. The hare was soon far out of sight, and to make the tortoise feel very deeply how ridiculous it was for him to try a race with a hare, he lay down beside the course to take a nap until the tortoise should catch up. The tortoise meanwhile kept going slowly but steadily, and, after a time, passed the place where the hare was sleeping. But the hare slept on very peacefully, and when at last he did wake up, the tortoise was near the goal. The hare now ran his swiftest, but he could not overtake the tortoise in time. The race is not always to the swift. Subscribe the channel.